Good morning, everybody. You are joining me on a brisk walk home from a night shift. It is chilly. I actually don't know how cold it is. I didn't look at my phone before I pulled out the recorder, but it's quite thick frost on the ground, and I am definitely not wearing enough clothes, so I'm walking briskly to keep warm. But you might be able to hear the birds in the background. I'll stay quiet for a minute, see what you can hear. Of course, the moment I stayed quiet so you could hear the backdrop of the birds singing, most of the actual singing ones stopped, so I think you could probably hear there was a wood pigeon, but the birds are busy singing away, and I like walking home on a Sunday morning because it's quite quiet on the roads. Normally when I walk home from work it's around school drop-off time, so it can be quite busy, although busy in Indonesian terms, which is not actually that busy compared to where we used to live in Edinburgh. But might be able to hear the crows now because I'm walking underneath the rookery. But I thought I'd pop on this morning to have a chat about my oh my goodness, sorry, just come off a night shift and now I'm blanking. My values. So this is a slightly wanky podcast topic that I sort of debated whether or not to do, because it feels, it just feels a little bit, self-indulgent. But I listened to, a Beautiful Mess podcast, which I'll link in the show notes. I've listened to A Beautiful Mess since they brought out a podcast, which was a few years ago now, 3 years ago maybe. But I've actually read their blog for, I don't even know, over 15 years. I remember reading their blog when I was in my first degree, and that was 2004 to 2008, so it was around that time that I sort of found blogs on the internet, and A Beautiful Mess was probably one of the original blogs that I found. And for people who don't know, they are two sisters who live in America, in not in Nashville, in Missouri. One of them just moved back to Missouri from Nashville, that's why I get confused. And when I first found the blog, they were running a vintage store, like a bricks and mortar store, and then they had the blog on the side, and they had like a little tea room, like selling cupcakes. It was like it was peak cupcake in the noughties, for those who remember that trend. And then through the years they've cycled through various different businesses. I find them really inspiring as two sort of female entrepreneurs, and because we're roughly the same age as well, feels like they went through life stages around the same time that I did, so like a lot of their content's been quite relatable from that point of view as well. So they own several apps now, they've written books. The blog is now primarily a food blog, like a recipes blog, so I don't read it in the same way that I used to. I used to have it sort of set up on my feed reader, and I would read all the new content, and they do a lot of, I haven't actually said what kind of content they do beyond food. They're kind of like Martha Stewart for the millennial generation, you know. They do a lot of DIY crafting. I think their tagline is something like stay home and craft, or stay home and make something like that. So they do a lot of DIY, a lot of crafting. In the past they did a lot of like fashion and style type posts as well, and then as they sort of rented homes and then bought homes, they did more sort of like home DIY, decor, interior design, renovation stuff. But in the last few years they've started the podcast, so a lot of the kind of content I used to enjoy reading on their blog, they now have in podcast form, which again just like perfectly suits the stage in life I'm at the moment, where I have sort of less time available for reading, but probably more time available for listening, because while I'm doing household chores or walking somewhere or whatever, I'm pretty much permanently listening to either a podcast or an audiobook. So I very much appreciate my favourite content creators moving into the podcast space, because it just means I can keep up with their content whilst walking the dog or building a potting bench, see last week's episode, etc. So yeah, but I thought they did an episode before Christmas that I found really interesting, about their sort of life values. So they each picked sort of 3 words that they felt sort of represented their values, and then sort of discussed why they picked that word. And it just it was a good thought exercise, I guess, for me personally to do myself. And then I was chatting with my bestie, we exchanged voice notes, and we were kind of talking amongst ourselves about our values as well. And I just thought this is a really interesting topic, because obviously it's very easy, especially in this day and age, at the risk of sounding like an old person, where everything moves super fast. You've got the whole of the internet in your pocket. There's this expectation of responsiveness that wasn't there 15 or 20 years ago. You would get a letter through the post, and then the expectation might be the fastest turnaround time would maybe be a week for a response to go back again, or obviously picking up the phone and speaking to someone on the phone. But then the expectation wouldn't be you would be around all the time to pick up the phone. It was sort of understood that if you phoned someone on their landline and they weren't in, you just wouldn't get them, and that was just how it was. Whereas these days, obviously, everyone's got a mobile. There's this sort of expectation that everybody's constantly available, and that you're sort of constantly being bombarded by things that need your attention. I honestly can't imagine how much worse this would be for parents. So if you're a parent listening to this, thinking amen to that, because there's a whole extra branch of child admin on top of your own life admin. But yeah, I find it hard enough sometimes to just keep up with my own adult life admin, to be honest. So more power to the parents out there who are listening. But yeah, I guess my point is, it's easy in this day and age for life to just kind of pass you by, and not necessarily in a sort of bad way, but in a way where you're just so distracted by what's going on around you, keeping up with all of the aforementioned life admin, that you kind of don't realise that you're maybe not living the kind of life that you wanted to live until it's almost too late. You've just sort of sleepwalked into it, because sometimes it's easier to just make the easy decision that's in front of you, isn't it, rather than actually stop and think about, is this exactly what I want, kind of thing. And I've definitely been guilty of that, and then had to sort of stop and readjust and wind back a bit. But yeah, I guess that's where I found this topic quite interesting, because I guess by having these sort of set values that you've thought about in advance, and whether you kind of write them down somewhere or you have them saved on a notes app on your phone, you can refer back to them time and time again to, every time you're making a decision, be is this in keeping with my values? Is this a decision that future Amy is going to thank me for, sort of thing? Beautiful sky this morning, pale pink, pinky blue. One of the things I like about living in Inverness is pretty much always see the hills regardless of where I am. So I thought, well, that's quite a good sort of thought exercise to do, isn't it? Even if you do it as a thought exercise once and you never refer back to it. But so far I've actually found it quite useful, just in general, to kind of have them at the back of my mind, sort of remind myself of them from time to time. So the 3 I came up with for myself were creativity, curiosity and kindness, and just so happens that you've got some alliteration there, which obviously helps with the remembering, but that wasn't intentional. And I will say, spoiler alert, creativity and curiosity I somewhat borrowed from Beautiful Mess Girls, but I honestly think I would have come up with them for myself anyway. So it just so happened that listening to that episode, I was like, yes, I absolutely resonate with everything that you're saying about those words, so I'm going to take them for myself. But if you start with sort of the easiest ones, I think for me, curiosity sort of represents lifelong learning, being open to learning new things, but also kind of keeping relevant. Like, I don't want to be one of these people as I go into quote unquote midlife. I don't want to be one of these people that sort of leans into being an old person, and I've definitely noticed a bit of that amongst my similarly millennial friends, that now we're sort of pushing 40, there's a bit of a like, oh, you know, got to get on, do stuff while we've still got working functional knees, backs, limbs, whatever, like insert body part here. There's a lot of that sort of dark humour, like, you know, the moment you turn 40 suddenly your knees stop working, and I kind of in a way resent being lumped into that group, because I'm the kind of person for whom fitness and health and activity is quite an important part of my life, and so I don't know, I kind of feel like at this point in my life, touch wood, you know, if we're spared and all that, I'm probably as fit and healthy as I ever have been, and I know that's, to a certain extent, that's just luck, right, and genetics, so I'm very grateful to have the able body that I have, and I recognise that that is a privilege that isn't afforded to everybody, but I also think it's something that I actively work on. Like, I try to make healthy food choices, I try to make sure I get the amount of exercise I should, and obviously I don't always manage it because, you know, I'm a human. Sometimes other things take priority, but overall I kind of resent this idea that, like, you know, once you hit 40 or whatever other arbitrary landmark, you know, it's all downhill from here kind of thing. So for me, curiosity is also partly kind of relevancy, like staying relevant, like kind of, but I don't like this phrase, but like keeping up with the kids kind of thing, you know, like learning about new trends or new words, so that when people, young folk, like in the workplace or whatever that you come across, or your friends' kids use words that you don't recognise, you know, instead of being like, oh, Tashaw, youngsters these days kind of thing, can't speak properly, instead going away and Googling it and being like, oh, sick doesn't mean vomit, it means cool, okay, good to know. Because I think, even though I personally might never use the word sick to mean cool, it's just nice to know that I know what it means, if that makes sense. So when people say at work, use it, I'm not feeling left out or irrelevant. And I think it's just having, for me, curiosity is about having an open mind, isn't it? It's about being aware that other people's life experiences are as valid as yours, and not leaning into that sort of grumpy old man persona of like the youth of today, and, you know, the music they listen to is so loud or whatever, you know. And I think when I look at people that in my opinion have aged well, quote unquote well, often there is a large element of staying open-minded and curious and staying relevant. So I think of my friend Moira, who is, I think, mid to late 70s, but she's really well informed about like the climate crisis, everything that's going on in the Middle East. You know, she can have a really well-informed discussion about that stuff because she understands that these topics are relevant, obviously both to her but also to the generations coming behind her, you know. Whereas I can definitely think of some less positive examples of older people where there's a bit of an attitude of like pulling up the drawbridge, well, it doesn't bother me nothing because I'm not going to be around for very much longer kind of thing. And maybe they don't verbalise that, but, you know, actions speak louder than words kind of thing, you know. So yeah, I definitely think for me, curiosity, like I'm a bit of a nerd. I like to learn new things anyway. I think that's partly why I enjoy things like podcasts, because it's like a little mini TED talk or whatever where you're learning something. But I think also just widening out that approach to your whole life, so that, yeah, you stay open-minded, you stay curious, and that curiosity helps inform, other parts of your life, like relevancy. Like Andrew, my husband, he enjoys music more than I do, so he tends to listen to like Radio 1 and the sort of the specific Radio 1 shows where they show new music. So he kind of keeps me relevant with the music, because I personally don't really listen to music that much. whereas I find like fashion and style stuff more interesting, so I tend to keep him relevant with oh, that's quite fashionable at the moment, or whatever, so yeah, I think you can also help keep each other relevant so that you grow old gracefully, I guess. So that's curiosity. My second one, oh my goodness, I'm blanking. We'll go on to kindness, because kindness is probably the one that I find the hardest on a day-to-day level. And it's funny because I feel like outwardly I put on quite a good appearance of being a nice person. That's not to say that I'm not a nice person, obviously. But I am quite a people pleaser. So I think sometimes I can come across like I'm being really like chill and friendly and cheery and it's all fine. And inwardly I'm actually like seething and resentful that I'm being made to do something that I don't want to do because I didn't feel able for whatever reason to say no. And that situation happens less and less these days. That was probably more a feature of my 20s, but I've sort of learned through multiple rounds of counselling / life experience when to say no to things. But yeah, I think kindness is something that I can be quite judgmental, especially because I work with the general public, and it can be quite difficult to work with the general public, as I'm sure any of you listening to this who worked with the general public can attest to. And so I can internally be quite judgmental, and I like to think it doesn't actually affect how I behave to someone because I'm extremely polite and people pleasing, but the fact that I internally think those thoughts probably, in some way, shape or form probably does come through to how I interact with people, and I would like to improve that, I think, especially in the workplace, because assuming I'm going to continue with my current job for the foreseeable, I don't think it's necessarily I don't think it's necessarily sustainable to be sort of judgerson all the time. So, and I don't want to burn out sort of emotionally, and I definitely feel sometimes like I put a lot of emotional effort into my work because I want to support people through, their sort of difficult times with their animals when they come into the vet. But then the problem is, I think it can be difficult because, I'm often dealing with neglect cases or abuse cases or, just avoiding getting run down by a Nissan Qashqai. And here's a post box, incredible. Godspeed, little lepers. So yeah, it can be quite difficult when you're dealing with people who have made, let's say, different life choices to you, specifically with regards to their animal. And because I feel quite strongly about the animal welfare aspect of things, it's hard not to get frustrated and become quite judgmental about the people that have owned the pets, but that's not ideal, and it's definitely not how it should be, and it's something that I've been trying to work on for myself for quite a long time now. But I think crystallizing it into one word, kindness. I need to be kinder to people because sometimes it's not their fault that they've made the choices that they have. It's a wider socioeconomic problem or societal problem. So I think I need to bear that in mind, that just because people have made different life choices to me doesn't necessarily mean that it's ultimately their fault that they're in the situation that they're in, But I think the other flip side with kindness is I'm not always very good at being kind to myself. And even as I'm saying all of this out loud, I'm thinking I'm being quite harsh on myself. Like, I'm quite good at my job, I like to think, and I've always had good feedback from clients and other colleagues that I've worked with. There's always the odd exception, right? Can't please everybody, but for the most part, I think I'm a nice person to work with, and a nice person to work for. So yeah, I think I'm probably... snowdrops, that's nice. That's the first snowdrops I've seen. Oh, lovely. I would take a photo for you, but there's quite a lot of litter. But you can imagine them poking their little white heads up through the soil. So yeah, I think sometimes I need to be kinder to myself as well. I think I can be quite hard on myself because I have a bit of a perfectionist overachieving streak. And again, although I'm trying to sort of learn to control that, I think that can definitely come out in ways where I won't let myself rest because I feel like I should be doing something productive, or I'll beat myself up over making, a food decision or an exercise decision or whatever. I just think I could probably also stand to being more kind to myself. So that's why I've got kindness. So we've got kindness, curiosity, creativity. And for the last one, creativity, thank goodness I remembered it. So the problem when I come off night shift is my brain just like blanks, goes into that like auto spooling, like the Windows or the Apple like loading symbol. So for creativity, I mean, kind of obvious, right? Like if you're here reading the blog, listening to the podcast, you're probably already aware that I'm a creative person. But I think creativity is not something that's been necessarily encouraged over the years. I think when I look back at school, I've got a blog post brewing on this, but I need to write it quite tactfully because I don't want it to sound like I'm criticising my parents. But I think I went to quite an academic school, and there was definitely an emphasis on your sort of classical type subjects, science, maths, history, like your kind of English, that kind of thing. And there was less of an emphasis on your sort of less classical subjects. And art was certainly something that I don't remember being overly, encouraged. Certainly not by my parents, but from my school as a whole, I don't think art was overly encouraged. So it was sort of viewed, those sort of unspoken atmosphere that you grow up in, but you're very aware of, but nobody's ever said it out loud to you. But I was very aware that like smart girls did, sciences and maths, and quote unquote dumb girls did PE and art kind of thing, which is really harsh when you say it out loud. That's absolutely not what I believe as an adult. But that was definitely the sort of atmosphere in which I was raised, both at home and at school, really. And I understand from my parents' point of view that, like, to their mind, good jobs with a capital G and a capital J come from having science, English, maths type GCSEs and A-levels. And I guess there was maybe less awareness back in the 90s and noughties of like the breadth of jobs that you could work and how you could have a very successful career doing other things, and I guess because the internet was not really a thing at that point as well, or if it was very early a thing. So there was less, these days it's like if you did art or graphic design at school, you're like kind of nailed it for the internet world, right? That you can find all kinds of different jobs using those creative skills on the internet. Whereas I guess when I was at school, it was more like if you did art, it was to become a quote unquote artist with a capital A, and thus you were sort of becoming an impoverished creative locked in a garage somewhere, desperately trying to make money selling oil paintings or whatever, which is obviously, I mean, I'm sure there were plenty of people who did art in the 90s and noughties who didn't have that attitude, but that was definitely the prevailing attitude of the sort of school and home life that I was raised in, which meant I was never really encouraged to do creative stuff, overly encouraged. So it was something that I picked up when I went to uni, and then I got into kind of knitting and crochet, and then I found the internet and the early internet kind of groups on places like LiveJournal, and that's when I got into blogs and realised there was this whole world of sewing blogs out there. So it was really the internet that sort of encouraged my creativity, and I don't want that to sound like I'm sort of criticising my parents, because my mum is actually quite creative, does like stained glass and pottery and things like that, but it's just not something that was sort of encouraged in me as a child, because I think there was this attitude of like, well, you won't make money doing it, so kind of what's the point, And now as an adult I realise that art is its own reward, right? and I'm trying to sort of foster that creativity in myself. But sometimes I can be quite bad for not giving myself the time and space to practice that creativity, or feeling like if I'm going to do it, it has to be productive in some way, I have to be making money from it, or it has to be building towards something. It can't just be creativity for creativity's sake. And actually Chris Atomic was talking about this on her latest vlog, which I'll post a link to below, about how sometimes it's nice to just learn a new skill and not feel like you have to monetize it. And I think she was, in that episode, she was doing lino cutting, is that what it's called, where you do prints. I've always wanted to try that, actually. And yeah, so I think I was like, yeah, absolutely, that resonates with me, because almost every hobby I've ever had I've tried to monetize in one way or another, because that I felt like that's what you do, kind of thing. So yeah, I think creativity is my last one. So I'll leave it here, made at home. I'm just going to check my bird feeders. This one bird feeder always gets blocked up. Yeah, it's totally blocked. I was thinking the robin in the front garden's not getting through his seed half as fast as the sparrows in the back garden are. I think it just gets kind of blocked up. So yeah, I'm going to go sort my bird feeders, and then have a little nappy nap before my next night shift. But thanks so much for listening, and as ever, would love to know your thoughts, and I'll speak to you next week. Bye.